31 times history was completely wrong about something. What if I told you that most of the facts you learned in history class were actually just really old fake news? From Viking fashion disasters to Napoleon's height complex that never existed, we've been fed more historical baloney than a medieval banquet. Today, we're ripping through 31 times history got it spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. Buckle up, because your childhood education is about to take a beating. 1. Vikings wore horned helmets. Let's start by destroying one of the most iconic images in history. The Viking warrior with massive horns sticking out of his helmet, looking like a heavy metal album cover come to life. It's dramatic, it's intimidating, and it's completely made up. Not a single archaeological find has ever uncovered a horned Viking helmet. Not one. The Vikings were practical warriors who understood that giant protrusions on your head in battle are basically just convenient handles for your enemy to grab while they're separating your skull from your shoulders. The horned helmet myth was invented in the 1800s by costume designers working on Wagner's operas who thought Vikings needed to look more exotic and barbaric for the theater. They literally just made it up because it looked cool on stage. So every Halloween costume, every cartoon, every terrible History Channel reenactment, all based on one theatrical designer's fever dream. The Vikings would be absolutely baffled by our obsession with giving them impractical headgear. 2. Napoleon was short. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man whose name became synonymous with short guy overcompensating, wasn't actually short at all. This is perhaps history's greatest roast that turned into accepted fact. Napoleon was 5 feet 7 inches, which was actually slightly above average height for a Frenchman of his era. The confusion came from a mix-up between French and English measurement systems, and because his personal guards were exceptionally tall, making him look smaller by comparison. But the real reason this myth spread? British propaganda. England was at war with France, and nothing undermines a military genius quite like making everyone think he's throwing a continental temper tantrum because he can't reach the top shelf. The British press ran satirical cartoons showing Napoleon as a tiny, angry man, and it worked so well that 200 years later, we literally named a psychological complex after him. Napoleon didn't have a Napoleon complex. He had an enemy with really effective PR. 3. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. Thomas Edison is credited as the brilliant lone inventor who gave us the electric light bulb in a flash of individual genius. It's the perfect American inventor story. It's also complete nonsense. Edison didn't invent the light bulb. He improved an existing design that had been worked on by at least 20 other inventors before him. His real talent wasn't invention. It was marketing, patent lawsuits, and taking credit. He had an entire team of engineers and scientists working in his lab, but he made sure his name went on everything. Edison was less genius inventor and more very aggressive tech startup CEO. He even went so far as to wage a smear campaign against his rival George Westinghouse, including publicly electrocuting animals to prove that alternating current was dangerous. The man literally electrocuted an elephant named Topsy to win a business argument. Edison's greatest invention wasn't the light bulb, it was personal branding. 4. Medieval people thought tomatoes were poisonous. Here's a fun one. People in medieval Europe supposedly thought tomatoes were deadly poison and refused to eat them for centuries. It's used as an example of how ignorant and superstitious people were back then. Plot twist: tomatoes weren't even in Europe during the medieval period. Tomatoes are native to the Americas and didn't arrive in Europe until the 16th century, well after the Middle Ages ended. And when they did arrive, wealthy Europeans were suspicious of them, but not because they were superstitious idiots. Rich people ate off pewter plates that were high in lead content, and the acidity of tomatoes would leach the lead out of the plates, actually poisoning people. They correctly identified that eating tomatoes off their fancy plates was making them sick, they just didn't understand the chemistry. Meanwhile, poor people who ate off wooden plates were enjoying tomatoes just fine. So it wasn't medieval ignorance, it was a legitimate case of, your expensive dishes are trying to kill you. 5. George Washington had wooden teeth. The father of our country, the man on the dollar bill, supposedly had a mouth full of wooden chompers. It's a weirdly specific detail that everyone just accepted. Turns out, it's wrong, but the truth is somehow so much worse. Washington's dentures were made from a horrifying combination of materials including ivory, brass, gold, and yes, actual human teeth, some of which were purchased from enslaved people. Wood was never part of the equation. The wooden teeth myth probably came from the fact that ivory dentures would stain over time and take on a wood grain appearance. So we downgraded the truth from horrifying exploitation to quirky wooden teeth, because apparently that makes for a better elementary school history lesson. George Washington's teeth are a perfect example of how we sanitize history to make it more palatable, even when the truth is far more important to remember. 6. Columbus discovered America. Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, proving the earth was round and boldly going where no one had gone before. Except for the millions of indigenous people who had been living there for thousands of years, and the Vikings who had established settlements 500 years earlier, and possibly ancient Polynesians, and the fact that educated people already knew the earth was round. Columbus didn't discover anything. He got lost on his way to India, stumbled into a continent, insisted he was in Asia despite all evidence to the contrary, and then proceeded to be so incompetently cruel to the indigenous people he encountered that he was arrested and sent back to Spain in chains by his own government. His actual legacy involves slavery, brutality, and being really, really bad at geography. We gave him a federal holiday anyway. Columbus didn't discover America. He just had better publicists than the Vikings. 7. Medieval people were illiterate peasants. The Middle Ages have been painted as a time when only monks could read, and everyone else was just a filthy, ignorant peasant living in mud. This is an impressively snobbish lie invented mostly by Renaissance scholars who wanted to make themselves look better by comparison. Literacy rates varied wildly by region and time period, but many medieval people could read and write in their local languages. Merchants needed to keep records, craftspeople followed written instructions, and even peasants often had basic literacy for practical purposes. Medieval Europe had universities, produced thousands of illuminated manuscripts, and had a thriving book culture long before the printing press. The real reason we think medieval people were all illiterate? Renaissance intellectuals literally named their own era the rebirth, implying that everything before them was dead. It's the historical equivalent of a band calling their album the only good music ever made. And 8. Einstein failed math. Albert Einstein, the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century, supposedly failed math as a child, giving hope to struggling students everywhere. It's a comforting story that says genius can emerge from anywhere. Unfortunately, it's completely false. Einstein was exceptional at mathematics from an early age. By age 15, he had mastered differential and integral calculus. The myth seems to have originated from a misunderstanding of the Swiss grading system, where 6 was the highest grade, the opposite of many other systems. Someone saw his grades, assumed he failed, and the story took on a life of its own. The truth is far less inspiring. Einstein was a child prodigy who was good at basically everything academic. Sorry, but you can't use Einstein as an excuse for bombing your math test. He would have absolutely destroyed you in calculus. At age 12. 9. Medieval chastity belts were real. The medieval chastity belt, a locked metal contraption worn by women to ensure their fidelity while their husbands were off crusading. It's become the ultimate symbol of medieval sexism and barbarism. There's just one problem: they didn't exist. There is zero credible evidence that chastity belts were used in the Middle Ages. The few surviving examples date from the 1800s and were likely made as curiosities or jokes. The entire concept was popularized by Victorian-era writers who were projecting their own anxieties about sexuality onto the medieval past. Think about the logistics here for a second. A locked metal device worn continuously? The medical complications alone would be catastrophic. Infections, basic hygiene, the inability to use the bathroom, it's a nightmare. The Middle Ages had enough real problems without us inventing bizarre torture devices for them. This myth says more about Victorian sexual hang-ups than it does about medieval reality. 10. Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere, one of the most famous lines in American poetry, commemorating a legendary solo ride to warn the colonies that the British were coming. Except Paul Revere didn't ride alone, and he definitely didn't shout, "The British are coming." Revere was one of several riders that night, including William Dawes and Samuel Prescott. And here's the kicker: Revere was actually captured by British soldiers and never completed his ride. It was Prescott who successfully delivered the warning to Concord. But nobody writes epic poems about Samuel Prescott because his name doesn't rhyme as well. Also, everyone in the colonies was British at that point, so yelling, "The British are coming," would have been like warning people that humans are coming. The actual warning was about the British soldiers or regulars. Paul Revere's legacy is basically 10% history and 90% a poem written in 1861 that needed a hero and picked the guy with the best name. 11. Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." Marie Antoinette, the out-of-touch Queen of France, supposedly responded to news that peasants had no bread by saying, "Let them eat cake," cementing her reputation as a clueless, cruel aristocrat. It's the perfect symbol of aristocratic indifference, which is probably why it was invented. There's no evidence Marie Antoinette ever said this. The phrase first appeared in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's autobiography, written when Marie Antoinette was still a child. He attributed it to a great princess, but didn't name her. The quote was later pinned on Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution as propaganda to turn public opinion against her. Was Marie Antoinette out of touch? Probably. Was she uniquely cruel? Not really. But when you need to justify executing a queen, it helps if everyone believes she's a heartless monster who mocks starving people. So they gave her a catchy evil catchphrase she never said, and it worked so well that we're still repeating it over 200 years later. 12. The gladiator thumbs down meant death. In ancient Rome, the fate of a defeated gladiator was decided by the crowd's gesture: thumbs up for mercy, thumbs down for death. It's been depicted in countless movies and paintings. It's also backwards, or possibly completely wrong. The actual Roman gesture is debated by historians, but the most credible evidence suggests that a thumbs up, pollice verso, or turned thumb, might have actually signaled death, not mercy. The gesture for mercy might have been a closed fist or a thumb hidden in the fist. Some scholars think we have the entire thing reversed. The modern interpretation comes from an 1872 painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme that popularized the thumbs-down gesture. So Hollywood and history classes have been teaching the opposite of what probably actually happened because one French painter made an educated guess in the Victorian era. Every gladiator movie got it wrong because of one dude's painting. 13. Witches were burned at the stake in Salem. The Salem witch trials of 1692 represent one of the darkest chapters in American colonial history, where dozens of accused witches were burned at the stake in a frenzy of religious hysteria. Except no one was burned in Salem. Not a single person. In Salem, Massachusetts, 20 people were executed during the witch trials, 19 by hanging, and one man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. Burning at the stake was more of a European witch trial method, particularly in Scotland and Germany. American colonies primarily used hanging. This is one of those cases where we've mashed together different historical atrocities into one confused memory. The Salem trials were horrific enough without adding inaccurate execution methods. But burned at the stake sounds more dramatic than hanged, so the wrong version stuck. History gets remembered wrong because the wrong version makes for better storytelling. 14. Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey as national bird. Benjamin Franklin supposedly wanted the turkey to be America's national bird instead of the bald eagle, which he thought was a bird of bad moral character. It's a charming, quirky story about one of America's founding fathers. It's also a massive exaggeration. Franklin never formally proposed the turkey as the national symbol. In a private letter to his daughter, he made a joking comparison, saying that the eagle on the Great Seal looked more like a turkey, and that while the eagle was a scavenger, at least the turkey was a respectable bird and a true original native of America. It was a sarcastic aside in personal correspondence, not a policy proposal. Somehow, this private joke became historical fact, turning Franklin into the guy who wanted a bird that gets confused by rain into our national symbol. Franklin had many eccentric ideas, but this wasn't actually one of them. We just really wanted it to be true because it's funny. 15. The Great Chicago Fire was started by a cow. On October 8, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire burned for 3 days, destroying thousands of buildings and leaving 100,000 people homeless. Legend says it all started when Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern in a barn. It's a perfect story, a simple mistake with catastrophic consequences. It's also probably slander. A reporter for the Chicago Tribune later admitted he made up the cow story because it was more interesting than the fire started somewhere in or around the O'Leary property, but we don't know exactly how. Mrs. O'Leary and her cow became scapegoats for a disaster that had far more to do with wooden construction, dry weather, and strong winds than with any specific bovine. The O'Leary family was harassed for decades because of this false story. In 1997, over 125 years later, the Chicago City Council finally passed a resolution exonerating Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. The moral of the story: never let facts get in the way of a narrative involving an allegedly clumsy farm animal. 16. Medieval people married as children. We've all heard that in medieval times, girls were routinely married off at age 12 or 13 to much older men. It's used as evidence of how barbaric and backwards the Middle Ages were. The reality is far more complicated and, surprisingly, more reasonable. While noble families sometimes arranged betrothals for very young children for political reasons, these were essentially contracts that wouldn't be consummated until both parties reached maturity. The Catholic Church set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but that doesn't mean people typically married that young. Statistical analysis of medieval marriage records shows that the average age for first marriage was actually in the early to mid-20s, very similar to many pre-industrial societies. Peasants and common people, who made up the vast majority of the population, married when they could afford to start a household, which meant waiting until their 20s. Child marriage existed, but it was far from the universal practice we imagine. We've taken practices of a tiny elite and applied them to everyone, giving us a skewed view of medieval life. 17. Humans only use 10% of their brains. This is technically not ancient history, but it's been repeated so often it might as well be. The myth that humans only use 10% of their brain capacity has been around for over a century, inspiring movies like Lucy and countless self-help gurus promising to unlock your potential. It's completely false. Brain imaging studies clearly show that we use virtually all parts of our brain, and most of the brain is active almost all the time. Even during sleep, the brain is highly active. The myth likely originated from a misunderstanding of early neurological research or from a motivational speaker who wanted a catchy hook. Think about it. Why would evolution give us this massive, energy-hungry organ? The brain uses about 20% of our body's energy, if we only used 10% of it. That's terrible biological design. The truth is we use 100% of our brain, we just don't use all of it at the same time for the same task, which is actually a sign of efficiency, not waste. 18. Medieval people threw chamber pots out windows. Picture medieval city streets, filthy, covered in human waste because people just dumped their chamber pots out of windows onto unsuspecting passers-by below. It's disgusting, it's vivid, and it's mostly myth. While this definitely happened occasionally, it wasn't the standard practice. Most medieval cities had regulations against this because, shocker, nobody wanted to live in a literal river of sewage. Cities had public latrines, cesspits, and gong farmers, yes, that was the actual job title, who were paid to remove waste. Violating sanitation laws could result in hefty fines. The myth was largely popularized by 18th and 19th century writers who wanted to emphasize how much more civilized their own era was. They exaggerated medieval filth to make themselves look better by comparison. Medieval cities definitely had sanitation problems. Every pre-modern city did, but the everyone just throws poop out the window thing is an exaggeration designed to make us feel superior. 19. Corsets caused women's ribs to deform. Victorian corsets were supposedly instruments of torture that crushed women's ribs, displaced their organs, and caused all manner of medical problems. It's become the symbol of historical patriarchal oppression, physically constraining women. While corsets certainly had issues, most of the extreme stories are exaggerated or false. The X-rays showing deformed ribs from corsets were often either medical abnormalities that had nothing to do with corsets or the result of extreme tight-lacing, which was a fringe practice, not the norm. Most women wore corsets that were supportive garments, similar to a modern structured bra, not torture devices. Many women actually found them comfortable and preferred the back support. The extreme anti-corset propaganda came from the dress reform movement, which had valid points about restrictive clothing but also spread exaggerated horror stories to make their case. Modern shapewear isn't that different from historical corsets, but we don't call Spanx instruments of torture, we call them uncomfortable but sometimes worth it for the right outfit. 20. Ancient Egyptians were wiped out. There's a weird persistent belief that ancient Egyptians mysteriously vanished, leaving behind their pyramids like some kind of Bronze Age Atlantis. In reality, Modern Egyptians are largely descended from ancient Egyptians. The civilization didn't disappear, it evolved. Egypt was conquered multiple times by Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, and others. Each conquest brought cultural and genetic mixing, but the core population remained. DNA studies have confirmed substantial continuity between ancient and modern Egyptians. The language changed from ancient Egyptian to Coptic to Arabic, and the dominant religion shifted from ancient polytheism to Christianity to Islam, but the people didn't vanish into thin air. This myth exists partly because we romanticize lost civilizations, and partly because some people have a hard time reconciling the achievements of ancient Egypt with modern Egypt. It's easier to imagine they were a completely different people than to acknowledge continuous cultural evolution over thousands of years. 21. Pirates made people walk the plank. Pirates forcing captives to walk a wooden plank over shark-infested waters while the crew watches and laughs is one of the most iconic pirate images. It shows up in every pirate movie and children's book. There's almost no historical evidence it actually happened. Out of thousands of documented pirate attacks and testimonies from the golden age of piracy, maybe 2 or 3 accounts vaguely reference something like plank walking, and even those are disputed. Pirates were practical criminals, not theatrical villains. If they wanted to kill someone, they just killed them. Making someone walk a plank is an unnecessarily complicated murder method when you're already a criminal with a sword. The plank walking myth was largely invented by 19th-century adventure novels and later cemented by Hollywood. Real pirates did plenty of terrible things: torture, murder, marooning people on deserted islands, but plank walking was apparently too much work. Turns out even pirates couldn't be bothered with that level of dramatic staging. 22. Medieval people believed in a flat Earth, Part 2. We covered this earlier, but it's worth diving deeper because this myth is aggressively persistent. The idea that Columbus was a brave genius battling against superstitious church leaders who believed in a flat Earth is a story invented almost entirely in the 19th century by Washington Irving in his biography of Columbus. The ancient Greeks proved the Earth was round and even calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy. This knowledge was preserved throughout the Middle Ages by Christian, Islamic, and Jewish scholars. Medieval maps often depicted the Earth as a sphere. University students in the Middle Ages studied a round Earth as basic fact. Columbus's critics weren't worried he would sail off the edge. They correctly calculated that he had massively underestimated the distance to Asia and would run out of supplies and die. If the Americas hadn't been in the way, they would have been absolutely right. Columbus was wrong about the math, accidentally found a continent, and then got credit for proving something that nobody had been disputing in the first place. 23. Samurai swords could cut through anything. The katana has been mythologized as the ultimate sword, capable of cutting through anything from armor to other swords to bullets. According to internet lore, Japanese swordmakers possessed some kind of mystical metallurgical knowledge lost to time. While katanas are impressive weapons, they're not magical. Katanas were designed to be effective against the type of armor common in feudal Japan, which was often made of lacquered wood and leather rather than solid metal. Against European plate armor, a katana would have significant problems. The steel folding technique used to make katanas was developed because Japanese iron ore was relatively poor quality and needed extensive processing to remove impurities. It was a clever solution to a materials problem, not evidence of supernatural craftsmanship. The myth of the supernaturally sharp katana was amplified by 20th-century martial arts movies and later by Western fascination with Japanese culture. Katanas are well-made swords perfectly suited for their intended purpose, but they're not lightsabers. They can't cut through castle walls or deflect bullets. They're just really good swords, which should be impressive enough without the fantasy elements. 24. Humans and dinosaurs coexisted. According to some fringe beliefs and certain theme parks, humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time, possibly with people riding T-Rexes like some kind of prehistoric rodeo. This is spectacularly, astronomically wrong and belongs in this list because a surprising number of people still believe it. Non-avian dinosaurs went extinct approximately 66 million years ago. The first human ancestors appeared around 6 million years ago. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have only been around for about 300,000 years. The time gap between the last dinosaurs and the first humans is larger than the time gap between the first dinosaurs and the present day. Humans are closer in time to the T-Rex's extinction than the T-Rex was to the Stegosaurus. The confusion comes from a deliberate campaign of misinformation fossils misidentified as evidence, and the fact that the Flintstones is apparently considered a documentary by some people. Birds are technically dinosaurs, so technically humans do coexist with dinosaurs. But that's probably not what people mean when they claim humans rode dinosaurs. 25. The forbidden fruit was an apple. In the story of Adam and Eve, the forbidden fruit that caused humanity's fall from grace is almost universally depicted as an apple. Renaissance paintings show it, Sunday school lessons teach it, and it's become inseparable from the story. The Bible never actually specifies what type of fruit it was. The original Hebrew text just says, fruit, peri. The association with apples likely comes from a linguistic coincidence in Latin. The word malus means both evil and apple. Medieval artists picked up on this pun and started depicting the fruit as an apple, and the association stuck. Some scholars have suggested it might have been a fig, since Adam and Eve used fig leaves to cover themselves, or a pomegranate, which had symbolic significance in the region. But honestly, the specific fruit doesn't matter. That's not the point of the story. We just really wanted it to be an apple because of a Latin pun, and now we can't get Apple Incorporated to stop using the imagery. The forbidden fruit wasn't an apple. It was just branding that got way out of hand. 26. Vikings used blood eagle executions. The blood eagle is one of the most gruesome execution methods in history. The victim's ribs are cut away from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, with the lungs pulled through the opening. It shows up in Viking sagas and has been depicted in TV shows like Vikings. Most historians believe it never actually happened and was literary exaggeration. The blood eagle appears in exactly 2 Norse sagas, written centuries after the Viking Age ended, in a literary tradition known for embellishment and symbolic imagery. There's no contemporary account of it actually being performed, and the anatomical logistics make it questionable whether it would even be physically possible the way it's described. It was likely poetic imagery that got taken literally, a metaphor for complete and shameful defeat turned into a gore fest by medieval writers and then taken at face value by modern audiences. The Vikings were certainly violent, but this particular horror show was probably just brutal fan fiction that we mistook for a history textbook. 27. Medieval peasants worked harder than modern people. The stereotype is that medieval peasants worked brutally long hours in back-breaking labor from dawn until dusk, every single day. While medieval agricultural work was certainly physically demanding, peasants actually worked fewer days per year than most modern workers. Medieval peasants had Sundays off, numerous religious holidays, and extended breaks during parts of the agricultural year. Estimates suggest peasants worked between 120 to 150 days per year, far less than the modern full-time worker who puts in 260 days. During slow agricultural periods, they had substantial leisure time. This doesn't mean their lives were easy. The work was physically hard, food security was uncertain, and medical care was non-existent by modern standards. But the idea that they worked constantly with no rest is wrong. The 40-hour workweek and year-round labor are relatively modern concepts. Medieval peasants worked hard when they needed to and rested when they could. Modern people arguably work more consistently, just less physically. 28. Fortune cookies are from China. Fortune cookies are served in virtually every Chinese restaurant in America, each one containing a small slip of paper with your fortune and lucky numbers. They're quintessentially Chinese, right? Wrong. Fortune cookies were invented in California in the early 1900s, most likely by Japanese immigrants. The exact origin is disputed, but the most credible evidence points to Makoto Hagiwara, who created them for the Japanese tea garden in San Francisco around 1914. During World War II, when Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, Chinese-owned restaurants picked up the tradition and fortune cookies became associated with Chinese food. If you go to China and ask for a fortune cookie, you'll get confused looks. They're about as authentically Chinese as General Tso's chicken, which, as we've established, was also invented in America. Fortune cookies are an American invention, created by Japanese immigrants, and marketed as Chinese. It's cultural appropriation wrapped in irony and baked into a cookie. 29. Medieval armor was so heavy knights couldn't move. The image of a medieval knight in full plate armor, so heavily encumbered that they needed a crane to mount their horse and couldn't get up if they fell down, has been used to mock medieval warfare as clumsy and primitive. This is largely nonsense. A full suit of plate armor weighed between 45 to 55 pounds, and the weight was distributed across the entire body. A modern soldier's combat load often weighs more and is less evenly distributed. Knights could mount horses, fight, and even do gymnastics in their armor. There are historical accounts and modern reconstructions proving this. The armor was designed for mobility, not just protection. The myth probably comes from ceremonial armor, which was much heavier and was never intended for combat, and from later satirical writings that exaggerated knightly incompetence. Medieval combat was actually quite athletic. Knights weren't clumsy tanks. They were highly trained warriors whose armor was sophisticated protective equipment. Turns out, people in the past weren't idiots who designed equipment that made them worse at their jobs. 30. The Greeks built the Trojan horse, continued. We mentioned this earlier, but let's dig deeper. The Trojan horse isn't just questionably historical. It's potentially one of the greatest misunderstandings in Western literature. Beyond the metaphor angle, there's another fascinating theory. Some scholars believe the wooden horse might have referred to a type of siege engine called a horse, a covered battering ram or mobile siege tower. These devices were sometimes referred to with animal names. The poetic account in Homer's Odyssey might have taken this military terminology and turned it into a literal giant horse because that made for better storytelling. Another theory suggests the wooden horse was slang for a naval ship, and the Greeks actually won through naval deception, not a giant sculpture. Or it could reference an earthquake. Poseidon, the god of earthquakes, was associated with horses, and the Greeks simply took advantage of a natural disaster. The literal interpretation, that the Trojans dragged a suspicious giant wooden horse into their impenetrable city, requires us to believe an entire civilization simultaneously forgot how warfare works. 31. Medieval torture was widespread and constant. Our final myth. The Middle Ages were a non-stop torture festival where every town had a fully staffed dungeon with an elaborate collection of horrible devices being used daily. This image comes almost entirely from museums, movies, and our collective desire to believe we're more civilized now. While torture certainly existed in the Middle Ages, it was nowhere near as common or as elaborate as popular culture suggests. Most legal systems had strict rules about when torture could be used, usually only for specific crimes and with official authorization. The elaborate torture devices we see in medieval torture museums are often Victorian-era fabrications or theatrical props from centuries later, just like the Iron Maiden we discussed earlier. Many of these museums are essentially scam attractions showing replicas of torture devices that never existed or were never widely used, presented as authentic medieval equipment. The Middle Ages had enough real problems, war, disease, social injustice, without us inventing extra horrors to pin on them. This myth persists because it makes us feel morally superior to our ancestors, which is a lot more comfortable than examining the systemic violence in our own modern societies. So there you have it. 31 times history was confidently, spectacularly wrong about something. From Viking fashion accessories that never existed to torture devices invented for tourist attractions, we've been fed a steady diet of historical nonsense mixed with just enough truth to make it all seem believable. Here's the thing that should really keep you up at night. If we got all of this wrong, stories that have been repeated for decades or even centuries, what else are we getting wrong right now? What facts are we teaching today that future generations will look back on and wonder how we could have been so confidently incorrect? History isn't just written by the winners. It's written by whoever has the best story, the catchiest headline, or the most dramatic painting. The truth is often boring, complicated, and doesn't fit neatly into a 45-second museum placard or a Hollywood movie. But maybe that's exactly why we should question everything we think we know. So next time someone tells you a fun historical fact, maybe ask for a source that's not a Victorian novel or a movie from the 1950s. And if you learned something today that made you question your entire education, hit that subscribe button and join us in questioning everything else we were taught wrong. What other historical facts do you suspect are complete nonsense? Drop your theories in the comments. Let's unlearn some more history together.